In Part 6 of An Honest Search for the Truth, we'll be discussing temptation and testing. Once again, our religious background was fundamentalist Christianity, that believes that the Bible is directly from the omniscient, omnipotent mind of the Creator of the universe, is without error, and is literally interpreted. Given that framework for this discussion, let us then first define some words so that we're all on the same page. These definitions are taken from a common secular dictionary. The word test is defined as to put to test or proof, the means by which the presence, quality, or genuineness of anything is determined, a means of trial. The word tempt is defined as to entice to do wrong by promise of pleasure or gain, to make trial of, or to induce to do something. Lastly, the word omniscient is defined as having infinite awareness, understanding, and insight, possessed of universal or complete knowledge. Now, for the record, there's no such thing as partial omniscience. Either you have complete knowledge or you're not omniscient. Biblical scripture tells us that God does not tempt man. James chapter 1 verse 13 says, "Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone." Christians teach instead that men are tested. To explain the difference between the two, I've heard it argued that temptation is an enticement to do evil, whereas testing is a process of proving something's worth. The difference between the two could be said that temptation implies an anticipation for the subject to succumb, and testing implies a hope for the subject to overcome. Consequently, when we read of instances where God tempted someone, Christians then assume that the word tempted actually means tested. Even if you make this assumption, you can't deny that God tries mankind. Whether you apply a test or a tempt definition, the outcome is the same. Either the subject obeys and succeeds, or disobeys and fails. The question is whether or not an omniscient God can test his creation, knowing their weaknesses and desires, knowing even the outcome of the test before it's given, and be considered just. The story of humankind's fall in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 2 is just one example of this. Adam and Eve were given everything they needed in the Garden of Eden, but they were prohibited from eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, by penalty of death. Ultimately, after being deceived by Satan in serpent form, Adam and Eve partook of the forbidden fruit, gained the knowledge of good and evil, and were subsequently banished from the garden, lest they eat from the tree of life and live forever. Let's take a minute to think about this scenario. As a parent, I can reasonably assume that my children will probably disobey me if I have them sit around a table where I've placed a bowl of candy that I specifically tell them not to eat before I leave the room. In fact, I would admit to myself as a parent that the situation wasn't very fair, and that I could have reasonably expected that at some point they were going to sneak some candy, especially if they were exposed to this bowl of candy every day. What purpose does the bowl of candy serve? Whether the scenario can be considered testing or tempting, the outcome is the same. The children will eventually partake of the candy. As a parent, I have an excellent handle on my children's nature and inclinations, so I have a good idea about the likely outcome of my little test. On the other hand, a truly omniscient God precisely knows his creation's propensity to succumb and the outcome to every test. Certainly in this case of Adam and Eve, God knew what the outcome would be to his test, that man would succumb. He knew this because before the beginning of time, God had already purposed to send Christ to redeem mankind from their fall from grace. In the story of the Garden of Eden, what purpose did the tree of knowledge of good and evil serve? In the candy bowl example, what if the children's punishment for eating the candy was death? Would that be just? Can I assume that I didn't actually tempt my children because I was hoping that they would obey me? If you place something desirable but off limits in front of someone with an appetite for just such an item for no other reason than to see if they can resist, aren't you tempting them? Another particularly disturbing example is the story of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis chapter 22. In this story, God requires Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac as a burnt offering in order to obey him. Ironically, God condemned human sacrifice as an abomination in the book of Deuteronomy, Yet this was the very thing that he had asked Abraham to do. On a related note, it's interesting to note that years later in the book of Jeremiah, God himself says that the thought of human sacrifice never entered his mind, despite this request he made of Abraham. And interestingly enough, it's the human sacrifice of Jesus Christ that is the foundation of salvation for believers in Christianity. One could argue that God never really intended for Abraham to follow through with the command to sacrifice his son, but Abraham was not aware of this. Otherwise, this would not have been an extraordinary test for Abraham. In fact, this wouldn't have been a test at all. One could also argue that anything commanded from God is automatically considered good or righteous, since he is our standard for what's good. Well, consider this analogous hypothetical situation. What if God asked you to do something evil like kill your family or blow up a building full of people as proof of your loyalty? Would a heinous act not be evil simply because the creator of the universe asked you to do it? Ironically, this idea of evil things becoming good simply because it was commanded by God is embraced by many fundamentalist Christians. It allows them to say things like, slavery's okay, women were treated just fine in the Bible, and the genocide of the inhabitants of the Promised Land was okay since it was directed by God. In The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, he makes reference to a paper called The Influence of Ethnic and Religious Prejudice on Moral Judgment by Israeli psychologist George Tamarin. Tamarin presented to more than 1,000 Israeli schoolchildren between the ages of 8 and 14 the account of the Battle of Jericho in the book of Joshua, in which the city and all of its inhabitants were killed with the edge of the sword. He then asked the children a simple moral question. Do you think Joshua and the Israelites acted rightly or not? They had to choose between A, total approval, B, partial approval, and C, total disapproval. The results showed that 66% gave total approval and 26% total disapproval, with only 8% giving partial approval. In the paper, justification for the genocidal massacre by Joshua is religious in every case. Even some of the disapproving answers were religious in nature. The control group for this experiment is the most telling regarding religion clouding moral judgment. To quote directly from the book, Tamarin ran a fascinating control group in his experiment. A different group of 168 Israeli children were given the same text from the book of Joshua, but with Joshua's own name replaced by General Lin, and Israel replaced by a Chinese kingdom over 3,000 years ago. Now the experiment gave opposite results. Only 7% approved of General Lin's behavior, and 75% disapproved. In other words, when their loyalty to Judaism was removed from the calculation, the majority of the children agreed with the moral judgments that most modern humans would share. Joshua's action was a deed of barbaric genocide, but it all looks different from a religious point of view, and the difference starts early in life. It was religion that made the difference between the children condemning genocide and condoning it.